Hi, I'm Rocco Stano, and welcome to StoryMakers. Today, one of my favorite topics, Manhattan, which is an island, which is part of New York City, mapping the story of an island. And the creator is with us, Jennifer Thermes. Jennifer, welcome, and thanks for creating this book, because we're actually sitting here on that island today. Tell us about the book, and it says mapping the story of an island.
So this is 400 years of the story of Manhattan Island, back from
400 years?
400 years.
In right there?
64 pages.
Oh, okay.
Actually, more than 400 years, because it begins with the land itself and goes through all of the different eras and the people who lived on the island.
So your story starts millions of years ago.
Yes.
Millions.
Yes. How did it become the center of the universe, in my humble opinion?
A very popular side, yes.
Right. So what attracted people to it? And it's situated in an estuary, so that's where the river comes down and it meets the saltwater sea.
Right.
And it makes for a very rich environment of animals and plants. Of course, Native Americans lived here for about 10,000 years.
10,000
Yes.
years, and they're still living here.
And they're still living here today, that's right.
Yeah, so the name of the Native Americans was?
The Lenape.
And here we show that time period.
Right, and they called it Mannahatta, which means island of many hills, because it was actually a very hilly island in the beginning, before the Europeans arrived.
And today when you walk along Manhattan, sometimes you can actually say, oh, there's a hill here.
There are hills, yes, and also there are glacial rocks that still peek through from underneath the actual island itself that you can see today in parts of Central Park.
Really?
And uptown in Inwood. So those are actual, millions of years old rock that are still around today.
Right. So the Europeans came, and this spread here talks about, was it Henry Hudson?
It was Henry Hudson.
Yes.
And
good. I know my history.
Yes. He was looking for a way to get to China, and he discovered the riches of the land and the beavers, and really it became a trading town for beaver pelts.
We'll get back to the beaver
Yes.
later on. There are so many interesting facts in your book, because New York and Manhattan is a very interesting place.
Yes.
And many New Yorkers think they know everything there is about New York and Manhattan. But what were some of the things that you found out that surprised you?
Well, that there was a pond that was actually located right near here called the Collect Pond. And that was sort of in the center of the bottom part of the island, and you can see it as it changes on some of the maps. And it gradually became filled in, and it had two streams running to the east and the west side of the island, and that became Canal Street eventually. We
were talking about maps, and your end papers show a map of part of Manhattan. The front end papers are one end.
Are the lower end, and this is the upper end.
The upper end.
Yes.
It is interesting. It is interesting. Because when you look at this map, I see like little rectangles and squares, and that is called what?
The grid, yes. Originally, this was where the Dutch settled, right? I mean, this tiny little point, and as the island was growing north, it became more and more chaotic. So they hired a man named John Randall Jr. to map the entire island, and it took him, I think, 12 years. He surveyed the entire island, and then they came up with this grid plan, which is, the numbered streets and avenues. And in the original plan, there was no Central Park. And then they spent the next decade or two building the actual grid, which some people were happy about, other people were not, because if your house was in the middle of an avenue, it had to be torn down or moved. And so one illustration, I have a woman throwing a cabbage at John Randall Jr., which I couldn't verify as a fact, but it was an anecdote.
But yeah, there were some people that were not
thrilled with it.
Not thrilled with him. How did Central Park come to be?
The city was getting more and more crowded, and they had started building the grid, but they realized there was no green space for people, and people need nature. even when you live in a city. So people would actually go over to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn to hang out and, you know, have a little picnic or something. So they decided that they needed to build Central Park.
A public green space.
A public green space, yes. The city held a contest, and Calvert...
They did?
Yes, there was a contest, and people submitted their designs, and Frederick Law Olmsted, of course, and Calvert Vaux won the plan.
Many people don't realize that when they were creating Central Park, that many people were dislocated from their homes.
Right,
so, yeah, and
right.
there was like a village there?
Yeah, so Seneca Village was the first middle-class African-American community that lived there. And, you know, like many things that are built, poor people often end up getting pushed out. And
Right.
it's a thing called eminent domain,
Right.
where the government comes in and says you have to leave. And so this was a thriving village that was forced to leave. I put it in there because I think it's important to remember that there are so many hidden stories that we don't always learn about as we're growing up. And for every good thing in history, there's maybe another side to it. And so
Right.
the people that built New York City, as well as the rest of the country, really are, you know, it started, you know, with enslaved people, and then immigrants have come and still come today and are very important because they form new communities and are what keeps our city and our country going.
Right.
Really.
I love these two illustrations because you show two different sections of the city, right? You know, the one here is the one that has those mansions, those
Right.
those grand houses.
It was Millionaire's Row.
Millionaire's
Fifth Avenue
Row.
was known as Millionaire's Row back then.
Right. Yes.
And
And
then the Lower East Side.
Lower East
Right.
Side, where the immigrants lived, and you could see that was a very thriving community too. But a lot of activity, a lot of business took place out on the streets. There would be people
Yes.
with push carts, and you show that there's somebody with a. I know there's a guy with a fish right
There's
there.
a fishmonger over there.
Right
and
there.
Yes, kids running around, and the streets were really a gathering place for people.
We talked about the beavers earlier, and about those poor beavers because they were being used for hats and different things like that. But we have some good news, right?
Yes, well, in the 70s, they started to clean up the environment and clean up the water, and beavers started to return, and they have actually seen one within the last year up in the, I believe, the East River or the Bronx River.
Really?
But they're starting to return, and fish are coming back to the Hudson River, so hopefully, you know, clean air and water are very important for
yes.
that.
This book has a dust cover and a case cover. The dust cover is the maps on both sides. But the case cover is fabulous because you get the majesty of the city and the glories of nature.
Of nature.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
nature's always around us in the city, even though it's a city.
Right, yes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And this is such an interesting book filled with so many interesting facts.
Thank you.
So remember, until next time, read a book in any format.